The first thing the hotel took was the color blue. Not all of it, not at once. It started with the memory of a specific shade, the impossible electric blue of a morpho butterfly's wings I had seen in a jungle documentary years ago. One moment the memory was there, vivid and shimmering in my mind's eye, a benchmark for every blue I had ever mixed on my palette. The next, there was just a hole. A colorless, shapeless void where that specific beauty used to be. I didn't notice it then, of course. The theft was too quiet, too subtle. The real horror of the Somnus Hotel isn't in what it does, but in how it convinces you that nothing is being done at all. It makes you the architect of your own undoing. My name is Julian Vance, and I'm a painter. Or at least I was. Before I came here, I was a prisoner of a different kind, locked in the sterile white room of a creative block that had stretched on for 3 agonizing years. My canvases were blank, my mind a desert. My agent, bless his greedy, well-intentioned heart, suggested a retreat. A complete disconnect. He'd heard of a place, an exclusive old-world establishment tucked away in some forgotten mountain range, famous for its privacy and its alleged inspirational qualities. The Somnus Hotel. The name itself felt like a promise of rest, of a mind finally quiet enough to dream again. Desperation is a powerful motivator. I booked a room for a month, packed my paints and canvases, and drove until the world I knew was just a faint signal on my phone. And then not even that. The final road to the hotel was a narrow, winding serpent of asphalt that seemed to fight the ancient forest for every inch of its existence. The trees grew so thick and tall that they blotted out the sun, casting the path in a perpetual twilight. When the hotel finally emerged from the gloom, it was like a photograph from another century. A sprawling Victorian masterpiece of dark wood and deep-set windows, it stood silent and majestic, absorbing the sound of my car's engine as if it were a minor disturbance. There were no other cars in the pristine gravel driveway, no sign of life at all save for a thin curl of smoke rising from one of its many chimneys. The air inside was heavy with the scent of lemon polish, old paper, and something else, something faintly metallic and sweet, like old blood or dried roses. The silence was the most profound feature. It wasn't just quiet, it was a thick, pressurizing silence that pushed against my eardrums. The grand lobby was a cavern of polished mahogany and deep crimson carpets, a silent testament to a forgotten era of luxury. Nothing moved. There was no music, no chatter, no distant clang of an elevator. Then from behind the monolithic check-in desk, a man appeared. He hadn't walked there. He was simply there, as if he had materialized from the shadows between my blinks. He was tall and unnaturally thin, dressed in a black suit so perfectly tailored, it seemed less like clothing and more like a part of his body. His smile was a perfect, white, geometric shape that did not touch his cold, still eyes. He said my name before I had a chance to speak it. "Mr. Vance, we have been expecting you." His voice was a low, smooth melody that did nothing to soothe the sudden, prickling anxiety on my skin. I managed to nod, my own voice feeling like a crude intrusion in the hallowed quiet. He pushed a heavy, ornate brass key across the counter. The room number was not a number but a name, the Alighieri Suite. "We are so pleased you chose the Somnus for your sabbatical," the concierge continued, his smile unwavering. "Many artists find our atmosphere uniquely conducive to creation. We pride ourselves on preserving what is truly valuable." His choice of words felt strange, rehearsed, yet I was too tired from the drive, too desperate for this place to be my salvation, to question it. I took the key. Its weight was significant, real. A small comfort in a place that was beginning to feel less and less so. The Alighieri Suite was beautiful, impossibly so. A vast room with a 4-poster bed, a stone fireplace, and a wall of glass that looked out over a sea of dark, unmoving pine trees. A brand-new easel stood waiting in the corner, a silent invitation. It was perfect. It was a tomb. I ignored the feeling, attributing it to my own cynicism. This was it. This was where I would work. This was where I would find myself again. That first night, sleep felt less like rest and more like a surrender. I plunged into a darkness so complete, it felt like I had ceased to exist. Then, I was awake. The clock on the bedside table was dark, but the room was bathed in a soft, silvery moonlight. And my mind was on fire. Ideas, images, colors, and compositions flooded me in a torrent so overwhelming it was almost painful. It was the breakthrough I'd been praying for years. I stumbled out of bed, grabbing my sketchbook and a piece of charcoal, my hand moving with a speed and confidence I thought I had lost forever. I drew for hours, lost in a feverish trance. A landscape emerged on the page, not of the forest outside, but of a place I had only ever seen in dreams. A city of spiraling towers under a sky with two suns. The detail was meticulous, the perspective flawless. It was a masterpiece. I knew it, with a certainty that was as profound as my own name. Exhausted, utterly drained but spiritually soaring, I collapsed back into bed, the sketchbook left open on the desk in the moonlight. The next morning, I woke to the bright gray light of a cloudy day. My first thought was of the drawing. I leapt out of bed, my heart pounding with a giddy excitement. I needed to see it in the daylight, to confirm that its genius was real and not just a product of a sleep-deprived fantasy. I reached the desk, my eyes falling upon the open page. And then my heart stopped. The drawing was there, but it wasn't. It was a ghost, a pale, faded echo of the vibrant, powerful image I had created. The sharp, decisive lines of charcoal were now faint and blurry, as if someone had tried to gently erase the entire thing. The details were smudged, the grand perspectives now weak and uncertain. It looked like a memory of a drawing, not the drawing itself. I touched the page and the charcoal felt loose, like fine dust. I told myself it was the light. I told myself I was tired. I told myself it was a trick of my own overwrought mind. But as I stood there, staring at the faded masterpiece, a cold, terrifying thought slithered into my consciousness. The hotel had given me a gift, and it had already started to take it back. Denial is a powerful anesthetic. For the rest of that morning, I administered it to myself in heavy doses. The charcoal must have been poor quality, I reasoned, old and brittle. The paper in the sketchbook was probably too absorbent, leaching the pigment from the page. I concocted a dozen logical, rational explanations, each one a thin blanket I pulled over the shivering, naked fear that the hotel itself was somehow responsible. I refused to let a single strange incident derail me. I had come here to work, to break the chains of my creative impotence, and I would not be deterred by a phantom. I decided to leave the sketchbook, with its ghostly drawing, closed on the desk. It was a fluke. Today, I would begin on canvas. Before starting, however, a small, nagging thought compelled me to go downstairs. Perhaps the concierge, in his eerie omniscience, would know something about the local humidity, or where I could procure a better brand of charcoal. I found him in the exact same position I had left him, standing motionless behind the polished mahogany desk. He didn't seem to be doing anything, not reading, not writing, just standing, as if he were a permanent fixture of the hotel's decor. He turned his head as I approached, his smile clicking into place like a well-oiled mechanism. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "I trust you had a restful night." "It was productive," I said, choosing my words carefully. I held up the sketchbook. "I did have a question. I'm not sure if you'd know, but is the air in the rooms particularly dry? I did a sketch last night, and it seems to have faded considerably." The concierge tilted his head, a gesture that should have been human, but felt studied, like an imitation. He did not look at the sketchbook. His gaze remained fixed on my face. "Inspiration can be a fleeting ghost, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice dropping a little, becoming more intimate. "It visits us, blesses us with a vision, and then it departs. Perhaps what you captured was not the image itself, but its essence, and the essence has now returned to the ether." He smiled again, a clean, sharp expression of absolute finality. It was the most elegant non-answer I had ever heard. It was a dismissal. He was telling me that what I had seen, or not seen, was my problem, not the hotel's. He was telling me I was imagining things. I felt a flash of anger, but it was quickly extinguished by a wave of uncertainty. What if he was right? What if I was so desperate for a breakthrough that I had exaggerated the brilliance of my own late-night scribbling? Defeated, I retreated to my suite without another word. The conversation had only served to solidify my resolve. I would paint. I would create something so solid, so permanent, that it couldn't possibly fade. I would prove the concierge and the doubting part of my own mind wrong. I set up the large canvas on the easel. I mixed my paints, taking comfort in the familiar ritual, the earthy smell of the oils, the satisfying scrape of the palette knife. The inspiration from the night before had not entirely vanished. A new image was forming in my mind, a portrait, a woman's face. I knew her, but I couldn't immediately place her. A lover from long ago, perhaps, or a face I'd seen in a crowd. It didn't matter. She was beautiful, with a sad, knowing look in her eyes. Eyes the color of a stormy sea. I began to paint. The hours melted away. The hotel, the concierge, the faded sketch, it all dissolved into the background as my world shrank to the tip of my brush and the emerging face on the canvas. I worked with a feverish intensity, the colors flowing onto the canvas as if they were being dictated to me by an unseen force. The skin tones were perfect. The light in her eyes was almost real. It was happening again. The block was not just broken, it was shattered. I was creating something magnificent. Late in the afternoon, I stepped back to admire my progress. The portrait was nearly complete. She looked alive, ready to draw a breath and speak to me. I felt a surge of triumph. This was real. This was oil on canvas. This could not be erased. I needed to clean my brushes. I turned to the small sink in the corner of the suite, my back to the painting for no more than a minute. I swirled the brushes in the turpentine, the smell sharp and clean. There was no other sound in the room. When I turned back, my triumph curdled into pure, cold horror. The painting was different. It was subtle, so subtle that for a moment I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The color of her eyes. I had mixed a specific, complex shade of gray-green, the color of the ocean just before a storm. Now they were just gray. A flat, lifeless battleship gray. The vibrancy was gone. It was as if a layer of life had been surgically removed from the painting while my back was turned. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. I could still see the faint undertones of the green I had used, but they were muted, recessive, dying. As I stared, a wave of dizziness washed over me, and I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. It was accompanied by a strange, hollow feeling in my mind. I tried to picture the woman's face, the one that had been so clear in my head just moments before. I tried to recall the exact shade of her eyes, the stormy sea green that had captivated me. I couldn't. The memory was blurry. The color was gone, not just from the canvas, but from my own mind. The hotel hadn't just taken the paint. It had taken the memory that the paint represented. I stared at the flat, gray eyes of the woman on the canvas, and for the first time I felt a terror so profound it felt like a part of my own soul was being scraped away. Panic is a cold fire. It ignited in my chest, a frantic, freezing energy that demanded action. My first coherent thought was to fight back, to defy this psychic vampirism. I would not let it have her eyes. I lunged for my paint tubes, my fingers fumbling with the caps, squeezing a thick worm of viridian green onto my palette. My hands were trembling, but my purpose was clear. I would paint them back. I would force the color, the life, back onto the canvas. I loaded my finest brush and leaned in close, my face just inches from the portrait. I carefully applied the fresh, vibrant green over the dull, lifeless gray. For a single, beautiful moment it worked. The stormy sea-green hue returned, brilliant and alive. A sob of relief escaped my lips. It was real, I could beat this. But my relief was short-lived. I watched, breathless, as the color began to change on the canvas itself. It was an obscene, impossible process. The fresh paint seemed to lose its saturation in real time, the vibrant pigments sinking into the canvas and turning to dust, the life draining out of it as if being siphoned away by an invisible parasite. Within seconds it was gone. The eyes were gray again, perhaps even duller than before, and I felt another dizzy spell, stronger this time, a piercing coldness behind my own eyes. I stumbled back from the easel, a choked gasp caught in my throat. I was not just witnessing a theft, I was witnessing a feeding. My panic subsided, replaced by something colder and sharper, the desperate need to understand. This place, this hotel, it operated on some kind of logic, some set of malevolent rules. If I could understand the rules, maybe I could find a loophole. Maybe I could survive. The faded drawing in the sketchbook, the grayed-out eyes in the portrait. Both were deeply personal creations, drawn from the wells of my memory and emotion. What if that was the key? What if the hotel only fed on art that had a soul? I decided to conduct an experiment. I would create something with no soul, no emotional investment, no deep-seated memory attached. A purely technical exercise. I looked around the room for a subject, and my eyes landed on a simple, white ceramic coffee cup sitting on the writing desk. It was perfect, anonymous, impersonal. I took a new page in my sketchbook and a fresh stick of charcoal. I placed the cup under the stark light of the desk lamp, studying its form, the simple curve of its handle, the way the light created a soft gray shadow on its surface. I forced myself to become a machine, a camera. I would not think about the taste of coffee or the warmth of a mug in my hands on a cold morning. I would only see lines, shapes, and shadows. I drew with a slow, methodical precision, my mind a blank slate of technical focus. The drawing that resulted was sterile, but accurate, a perfect, lifeless replica of a coffee cup. I placed the open sketchbook on the bed, propped against a pillow, where I could watch it from the armchair across the room. And then I waited. The silence of the suite pressed in on me again, thick and watchful. Hours passed. I did not move, my eyes fixed on the drawing. Nothing happened. The lines remained sharp, the shadows deep and unwavering. A fragile, dangerous hope began to bloom in my chest. This was it. This was the answer. The hotel wanted emotion. It wanted memory. It feasted on the personal. I could stay here in this silent, elegant prison and create my sterile, technical art. I could work. I would be safe. I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made me laugh. I had outsmarted it. I had found the loophole. My gaze softened on the drawing of the cup. It was a good drawing, technically. The perspective was perfect. It reminded me of my first-year art studies, of the long, frustrating hours spent drawing still lifes. It reminded me of my first instructor, a gruff old man who had told me I had a gift for capturing light. It reminded me of drinking coffee with my father on Sunday mornings, from cups that looked just like this one, the steam rising between us in the quiet morning air. A warm, simple memory I hadn't accessed in years. It was a fatal mistake. The moment the emotional connection was made, the moment the drawing ceased to be a technical exercise and became a vessel for a personal memory, I saw it. It started at the rim of the cup, a subtle softening of the charcoal line, a slight blurring, as if a single drop of water had fallen on the page. I watched, paralyzed, as the fading process began to creep down the side of the drawing, the stark white of the ceramic turning into a muddy, indistinct gray. The shadow, once so precise, began to bleed into the light, and I finally understood the terrifying, impossible truth of my prison. The hotel didn't just feed on emotional art, it fed on the very act of creation itself. It was impossible to create something, anything, without investing a tiny spark of yourself, a flicker of a memory, an echo of an experience. That spark, that connection between the artist and the art, that was the currency of the Somnus Hotel. That was the price of admission. To create was to be consumed. To not create was to surrender to the very emptiness I had come here to escape. I was trapped. I looked around the beautiful, silent suite. This wasn't a room. It was a processing plant. I wasn't a guest. I was an ingredient. I held up my hands, staring at them not as tools of creation, but as the very instruments that would facilitate my own slow, methodical erasure. For a long time I did nothing. I sat in the armchair, my hands lying limp in my lap, and I stared at the wall. The realization I had come to was a paralysis, a venom that froze my blood and locked my muscles. To create was to die. It was that simple, that monstrous. My own talent, the very core of my identity, was a weapon pointed directly at my own soul. So I chose to do nothing. I would become a stone. I would not paint. I would not draw. I would not even allow myself to appreciate the elegant composition of the furniture in the room. I would starve the beast. I would give it nothing to feed on. I would survive through sheer, absolute inertia. This, I soon discovered, was its own unique form of torture. For an artist, a mind kept intentionally blank is a battlefield. The silence I imposed on my own thoughts was a vacuum, and the hotel, it seemed, abhorred a vacuum. The inspiration I had so desperately craved for 3 years was now my most relentless enemy. It was no longer a floodgate opened, but a poison being force-fed to me. I had to actively fight the urge to see the poetry in the way the dust motes danced in a sunbeam. I had to crush the impulse to trace the beautiful, sad curve of a dead leaf on the windowsill. The hotel had turned my own nature against me, and the hotel itself began to fight back. It did not like being starved. The temptations started subtly. A faint melody, hauntingly beautiful, would seem to drift from the walls, a composition I had never heard but felt I almost recognized. It was a phantom symphony, and my fingers would ache to grab a pencil and transcribe the notes. Later, I would hear whispers in the sound of the wind outside the window, fragmented lines of poetry that were so perfect, so profound, that it was a physical pain not to write them down. The hotel was dangling masterpieces in front of me, baiting the trap with my own deepest desires. The visual temptations were even worse. The light in the suite would shift and change in unnatural ways, casting the most exquisite, complex shadows on the floor, creating chiaroscuro effects that would have made Caravaggio weep. The view from the window, once just a static wall of pine trees, became a living canvas. The colors of the needles would deepen to an impossible emerald. The sky would bleed into a violet I had never seen in nature. The world outside my window was a constant, unfolding masterpiece, and I had to keep my eyes squeezed shut, not to look at it, not to let the beauty in, because I knew, with chilling certainty, that it was a lure. I couldn't stay in the room. The suite had become a torture chamber of tailored temptations. I had to get out, to walk, to see if there was anyone else in this gilded prison who was still whole. I opened the door and stepped into the long, silent hallway. The crimson carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps. The air was still and cold. I walked for what felt like an eternity, past identical, closed doors. Then I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the hall, looking out a tall, arched window at the oppressive forest. It was one of the other guests I had only glimpsed before, a woman with pale skin and long, dark hair. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress, and she was unnervingly still. I approached slowly, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I needed to know. I needed to ask. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a dry croak. She didn't turn. She didn't even seem to register my presence. I moved to stand beside her, looking at her face. Her eyes were open, but they were vacant, like polished stones, staring at nothing. Her face was a beautiful, empty mask. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. Her head turned toward me with a slow, mechanical smoothness. Her eyes focused on me, but there was no recognition in them, no spark of life. There was only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. "What is this place?" I whispered, the question feeling enormous, forbidden. Her lips parted, and for a moment only a dry, rasping sound came out. Then she spoke, her voice a faint, papery whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "I was a composer," she said, her vacant eyes looking through me. "I wrote a symphony. It was so beautiful." A flicker of something, a ghost of a memory, passed through her expression. "The hotel loved it. It's still beautiful. Sometimes you can hear it, when the walls are listening." Her words were a shard of ice in my gut. It was true. She was one of them, a creator who had been fully and completely consumed. I grabbed her arm, my grip more desperate than I intended. "How do you stop it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How do you fight it?" She looked down at my hand on her arm as if it were a strange insect, with no comprehension. Her gaze drifted back to my face, and a moment of startling, terrifying clarity entered her eyes. It was a look of immense pity. "You can't stop it," she whispered, her voice a little stronger, a little more urgent. "It always gets what it wants, but you have to fight for the last thing, the most important thing." She leaned closer, her breath cold and odorless. "Don't let it take your name," she rasped. "It's the last thing to go. Once it has your name, you don't even get to be a ghost." And with that, the light in her eyes extinguished. She turned her head back to the window, her body becoming still once more. She was gone again, retreated back into the empty shell she now inhabited. I was left alone in the hallway, the composer's warning echoing in the oppressive silence. It wasn't just my art. It wasn't just my memories that were on the line. It was my name, Julian Vance. The hotel wanted to erase the very fact that I had ever existed. I stumbled back to my suite, the composer's words a frantic, screaming siren in my head. Don't let it take your name. It was the last thing, the final frontier of the self. My art, my memories, they felt like limbs, essential parts of me that were being amputated. But my name was my spine. It was the core of my being, the anchor that held all the other pieces together, Julian Vance. Without it, I would not just be an empty shell. I would be a nameless, drifting ghost in this beautiful, cursed place. A new kind of fight ignited within me. It was no longer about escaping, no longer about understanding. It was about preservation. A desperate, primal need to hold on to my own name. My strategy of inaction was a failure. The hotel's temptations were too strong, too tailored to my soul. I needed a new strategy. I needed a ritual of my own, not of creation, but of defiance. I would not create art. I would create proof. I grabbed my sketchbook, the one with the faded masterpiece and the ghostly coffee cup. I flipped to a clean white page. I took a piece of charcoal, its familiar weight in my hand now feeling dangerous, like a loaded weapon. I would not draw. I would write. I would write the two words that now meant more to me than any others. I pressed the charcoal to the paper and wrote, in my own familiar, slightly slanted script, Julian Vance. The act felt powerful, a small rebellion. I wrote it again directly below the first. Julian Vance. And again, and again. I filled the page with my name, a repeating mantra of identity. I tried to make the act mechanical, devoid of flair or creativity. This wasn't art. This was a statement of fact. This was an anchor against the tide. I am Julian Vance. I am Julian Vance. I am Julian Vance. I am real. I finished the page, a dense black field of my own name, and looked at it with a grim satisfaction. I would do this every day on every page. I would fill books with my name until there was no blank space left for the hotel to occupy. But then my eyes drifted to the top of the page, to the very first signature I had written. A cold dread, now horribly familiar, washed over me. It was fading. The sharp black lines were softening into a hazy gray. I watched, my hope crumbling to ash, as the second signature began to blur, then the third. The hotel did not care about intent. It did not distinguish between a masterpiece and a simple signature. The act of making a mark, of affirming my existence on the page, was an act of creation, and the hotel was devouring it. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through me. I threw the sketchbook across the room. It was not enough to write it. I had to carve it. I had to make a mark so deep, so permanent, that this place could not heal from it. I grabbed the heavy brass room key, its teeth sharp against my palm. I lunged at the ornate mahogany desk and began to carve my name into its polished surface. The wood splintered and tore under the force of my frantic scraping. I carved my name with all the strength I had, the letters a deep angry scar in the wood. Julianvance. I finished the final letter and stood back, panting, my arm aching, and then I watched, my rage turning to icy despair as the wood began to change. It was a slow, sickening process, like watching a wound heal in reverse. The splintered edges softened, the deep grooves grew shallow, the dark color of the exposed wood lightened until it seamlessly matched the polished surface around it. Within a minute, my name was gone. The desk was pristine, as if I had never touched it. Julian Vance, I whispered to the empty room, my voice trembling. My name is Julian Vance. As if in response, a new sound began. It was the music again, the phantom symphony drifting from the walls. But this time, there were voices woven into it, soft, overlapping whispers. They were not saying my name. They were saying others. Thomas Adler, Eleonora Rossi, Kenji Tanaka, Sarah Chen, the names of the lost, the names of the forgotten. The hotel was trying to drown me in the ghosts of its other victims, to overwrite my identity with theirs. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the whispers were inside my head. I stumbled backwards, my hand fumbling for my wallet in my pocket, needing some tangible proof of who I was. I pulled it out and flipped it open to my driver's license. I stared at the signature line beneath my grainy photo, the elegant loop of the J, the sharp peak of the V. They were smudged, blurry, almost illegible. A wave of nausea hit me. I threw the wallet aside and scrambled for my luggage, for the leather tag my mother had insisted I use. The embossed letters of my name were there, but they were worn down, smoothed over, as if handled by 1,000 ghostly hands. I ran to my art supplies, to the beautiful palette knife my father had given me for my graduation. It had my initials engraved on the handle. I held it up to the light. The metal was smooth, blank, and cold. The hotel was not just erasing my future attempts at identity. It was reaching back in time. It was erasing the proof that I had ever existed before I even walked through its damned doors. This was not a battle I could win by hiding or by defending. This was a war against reality itself, and I had no idea how to fight back. Despair is a strange and silent predator. For a few long moments, it had me in its jaws. I sat on the floor of the Alighieri suite, the world's most elegant abattoir, surrounded by the ghosts of my own identity. My wallet with its blurred signature, my luggage with its smoothed-over tag, my palette knife with its blank handle. I was being systematically untethered from reality, and I had no anchor to hold on to. The silence of the room was the silence of a void, waiting patiently to swallow me whole. My strategy of defense had failed. My strategy of defiance had failed. I was a man in a locked room, being asked to fight a shadow that was eating the light. And that was when the thought finally crystallized, born not of hope, but of pure, nihilistic rage. How do you attack a place that feeds on creation? The answer was so simple, so obvious, that I almost laughed. You don't create, you destroy. I looked at my art supplies, the instruments of my slow suicide, my beautiful, expensive oil paints, my perfectly balanced brushes. The hotel loved these things. It loved what they could do. It loved the beauty, the memory, the soul that they could channel onto a canvas. And in that moment, I knew what my attack had to be. If the hotel was a connoisseur of fine art, I would serve it a meal of pure poison. I would not create a masterpiece. I would create a wound. My target was the room itself. The pristine, cream-colored walls, the elegant, understated furniture, the very picture of taste and tranquility. It was all a facade. It was the digestive tract of the beast, and I was going to make it sick. I stood up, a new and terrible energy coursing through me. I was no longer a victim. I was a saboteur. I didn't reach for a brush. A brush was a tool of control, of intent. This was not about control. This was about chaos. I walked to my paint box and grabbed a tube of lampblack, squeezing a thick, oily worm of it directly into the palm of my hand. The paint was cold and slick. Then I grabbed a tube of cadmium yellow, a sickly, jaundiced color, and squeezed it into my other palm. I looked at the walls, my canvas. My first act was a violation. I walked to the wall opposite the bed, the wall that was the first thing I saw upon waking, and I pressed my black-drenched hand against its perfect, smooth surface. I dragged my hand downwards, leaving a jagged, ugly scar of black paint. The sound of my palm scraping against the wall was brutally loud in the silence. It was a scream. I dipped my other hand in the yellow and slapped it beside the black, then smeared the two colors together, creating a muddy, nauseating olive green. A strange euphoria filled me. I was fighting back. I was desecrating the temple. I grabbed a tube of alizarin crimson, a deep, blood-like red, and began to fling it at the walls. I used my fingers, my palms, my forearms. I painted not with form or composition in mind, but with pure, unadulterated aggression. I drew jagged, meaningless lines that looked like cracks in the very foundation of the building. I made chaotic, swirling patterns that seemed to mock the very idea of beauty. This was not art. This was anti-art. An inoculation of ugliness designed to poison the entity that was trying to consume me. As I worked, as I turned the beautiful suite into a Jackson Pollock painting from hell, I noticed the atmosphere in the room began to change. A deep, penetrating cold seeped in, far colder than the autumn air outside. The faint, sweet smell of roses and old blood that had always lingered in the background intensified, becoming cloying, thick, and suffocating. The silence, once passive and oppressive, now felt active. It was a heavy, furious silence, the held breath of a predator that has been wounded. I felt a mounting pressure in my skull, a low psychic hum of pure rage. I was hurting it. The hotel was a being of pure aesthetic, and what I was doing was causing it a profound, elemental pain. I was a vandal in a god's own museum, and the god was angry. Fueled by this knowledge, I worked faster, more frantically. I smeared black paint over the crystal-clear glass of the window, blotting out the cursedly beautiful forest. I drew a grotesque, smiling face on the polished surface of the mahogany wardrobe. I emptied tube after tube of paint, turning the tranquil sanctuary into a visceral, vibrant nightmare. Finally, I was done. I stood in the center of the room, panting, my hands and arms slick with a rainbow of chaotic color. The room was almost unrecognizable. It was a testament to my rage, my fear, my refusal to simply fade away. As a final act of defiance, I walked to the elegant white door of the suite, dipped my hand in the remaining black paint, and planted a single perfect handprint in its center, a final signature. My mark. And that's when I heard it. A sound so alien in this silent place that it made me flinch. It was not a whisper, not music. It was a sharp, definitive, mechanical sound. It was the sound of the heavy-duty lock on my suite's door engaging from the outside. A loud, solid final click. I stared at the door, at my black handprint. The silence that followed the click was different. It was no longer the silence of a waiting predator. It was the silence of a cage that has just been locked. I had not been a prisoner before, not really. I had been a guest, an ingredient being processed. But now, by fighting back, by wounding the beast, I had changed my status. I was no longer a meal to be consumed. I was a contamination to be contained. I had finally gotten the hotel's undivided attention, and I had a terrifying feeling that I was about to find out what it did to its enemies. For a long moment, I stood frozen in the center of my desecrated sanctuary, the sound of the lock echoing in the furious silence. My first instinct was a foolish, animal one. I ran to the door and grabbed the heavy brass handle, turning and pulling with all my strength. It didn't budge. I rattled it, shouting, my voice a raw, ragged sound that the room seemed to absorb instantly. The door was as solid and immovable as a wall of solid rock. The click had not been a warning. It had been a verdict. The euphoria of my rebellion evaporated, leaving behind the cold, metallic taste of pure terror. I had provoked a god in its own temple, and now the temple had become my tomb. The hotel's retaliation was not immediate, not violent. It was something far more insidious. It began by taking away my world. The ornate lamps in the suite, which had been casting a warm yellow glow, began to flicker. One by one they went out, each one extinguishing with a soft, final pop. Soon the only light was the weak gray illumination filtering through the window I had smeared with black paint. The room was plunged into a deep, oppressive gloom, my vibrant, chaotic artwork reduced to murky, indistinct shadows on the walls. Then it took the air. The cloying, sickly sweet smell of roses and rage that had filled the room began to recede. It was not replaced by a cleaner scent, but by nothing. The air became sterile, neutral, utterly devoid of any odor. It was like breathing in a vacuum. My senses were being systematically dismantled. The hotel was sealing me off, not just physically, but sensorially. It was creating a perfect, silent, lightless, odorless void in which to deal with me. And in that void, the whispers began again. They were different this time. No longer a faint, sorrowful chorus of forgotten names. They were now clear, distinct, and directed at me. They slithered into my mind from the oppressive silence, the voices of the lost artists, now twisted into a choir of judgment. "You could have been beautiful," a woman's voice whispered, a voice that sounded like shattered crystal. "You could have lived forever on our walls." "He wastes the gift," a man's voice rasped, filled with a jealous anger. "He fights the one thing that gives him purpose. He paints with noise and fury," another voice hissed. "He will be forgotten. He will not even be a memory. He will be nothing." The voices were relentless, a psychological assault designed to break me, to make me regret my defiance. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but they were inside my head. When I opened my eyes, the true horror began. My anti-art, the chaotic testament to my rage, was changing. In the deep gloom, the random, jagged patterns I had painted on the walls started to move, to coalesce. The black and red smears shifted like oil on water, the lines bleeding into one another, forming new shapes. I saw faces, hundreds of them. They appeared and vanished in the paint, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with a permanent, captured agony. The hotel was taking my chaos, my ugliness, and it was using it to create its own, far more terrifying art. It was absorbing my rebellion and turning it into a new gallery of torment. I stumbled backwards, away from the screaming walls, a choked sob escaping my throat. I tripped and fell, landing hard on the floor. I looked down at my hands, still covered in the drying paint from my frantic work. And then I saw it. The paint was moving. It was a slow, subtle motion, almost imperceptible at first. The patch of lamp black on the back of my hand, the one from my final defiant handprint on the door, was spreading. It crawled over my skin with the deliberate, unnatural slowness of a slug, its edges creeping towards my knuckles. It was no longer paint. It was something alive, or something that mimicked life in a way that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the bathroom, fumbling for the light switch. Nothing. The darkness in here was absolute. I turned on the taps, the sound of splashing water a shocking intrusion into the silence. I thrust my hands under the stream, scrubbing at the black stain with a frantic energy. But the paint wouldn't wash away. The water sluiced over it as if it were glass. The stain remained, and as I watched, it continued its slow, inexorable crawl up the back of my hand. It felt cold, impossibly cold. It was leaching the warmth from my skin, a tiny, spreading patch of winter on my flesh. I could feel it, a faint, tingling numbness, as if my own hand was slowly being put to sleep. I scrubbed harder, my nails scraping uselessly against my skin, my panic rising into a full-blown, throat-shredding scream. I had thought that by defacing the room I was attacking the hotel, poisoning it, with my ugliness. I had been catastrophically wrong. I had not wounded it. I had only given it a new canvas. I had only invited it in. The paint was not a weapon, it was a conduit. A bridge from the hotel's consciousness directly to my own body. The walls of my prison were no longer the four walls of the suite. The prison was becoming my own skin. My scream was a raw, useless thing. The absolute silence of the suite swallowed it without a trace. I was on my knees on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, my hands raw from scrubbing, staring in abject terror at the crawling black stain. It was pointless. The water had no effect. The paint, or whatever it was now a part of me, as inseparable from my skin as a birthmark. My panic began to subside, replaced by a chilling, morbid fascination. I stopped scrubbing and simply watched. The blackness was not just spreading, it was organizing. The amorphous stain began to thin out, branching into delicate, intricate lines that snaked over my knuckles and up towards my wrist. It was forming a pattern, a complex, filigree-like design that was both beautiful and deeply grotesque. It looked like a dark, ornate tattoo being etched into my skin by an invisible, malevolent needle. The aesthetic was unmistakable. It was the same ornate Victorian elegance that adorned the hotel's architecture. It was the hotel's own artistic style, its brand of beauty, being permanently imprinted upon my flesh. I had tried to mar the hotel's perfect canvas. Now it was turning me into a new one. As the dark pattern grew, so did the numbness. The tingling coldness intensified, and I realized with a fresh wave of horror that I could no longer feel the cold tile beneath my painted hand. I pressed my fingers against the floor, then harder. There was pressure, but no sensation of texture, no temperature. The nerve endings in my own skin were dying, being overwritten by the hotel's art. This was a new kind of erasure, a physical one. It was consuming my ability to feel the world, replacing it with its own cold, dead beauty. I looked at my other arm, where streaks of blood red and sickly yellow from my earlier frenzy were still smeared. They too had begun to move. The crimson lines slithered and merged, forming shapes that looked like thorny roses, their petals sharp and aggressive. The yellow paint coalesced into small, precise dots that looked like a field of jaundiced, unblinking eyes, and each color brought with it a distinct and violating emotional texture. Where the red thorns crawled, I felt a surge of irrational, burning anger. Where the yellow eyes stared up at me, a wave of gut-wrenching paranoia washed over me. The hotel was not just painting on me, it was painting with me. It was using its colors to manipulate my emotions, to turn my own biochemistry into another medium for its art. A sound from the other room made me jolt. It was a soft, scraping sound. I rose slowly, my body trembling, and crept out of the bathroom. I peered into the main suite, now a landscape of deep, impenetrable shadows. I could just make out the wall where I had smeared the first ugly streak of black paint. It was gone. The wall was a clean, perfect cream color. I looked at the door where my final defiant handprint had been. It was pristine, the wood polished and gleaming. The horrifying truth dawned on me. The hotel was healing itself. It was transferring the desecration, the ugly chaos I had thrown onto its walls, directly onto me. I was the price of its immaculate upkeep. I was becoming the repository for all the ugliness I had created. My body, the canvas for the very vandalism I had committed. The supreme, cruel irony of the place was that it always restored its own beauty, always balanced its own books, and I was now the debt. I sank to my knees, the weight of this new reality crushing me. I was trapped, not just in a room, but in my own body, which was now being actively, hostilely redecorated by a parasitic entity. And then I heard the voice. It was not one of the ghostly whispers of the forgotten artists. It was the calm, impossibly smooth, melodic voice of the concierge. It was as clear as if he were standing right beside me, but he wasn't. The voice was coming from inside my own skull. The original canvas was found to be unsuitable, the voice said, its tone clinical, detached, like a curator dictating notes. It was necessary to transfer the work to a new canvas, a more permanent one. I clutched my head, a raw scream tearing from my throat, though I knew the sound would go no further than my own ears. The concierge, the human face of this monstrous place, was now inside my mind. He was my warden, my curator, my commentator. I looked down at my arms, at the crawling, living tapestry of emotionally charged paint that was steadily claiming my skin. The hotel was no longer just feeding on my memories or my identity. It was turning my body into a living, breathing art gallery for its permanent collection. I was to become an exhibit in the museum of my own downfall. The lock on the door had been a mere formality. The real prison was my flesh, and the warden was now a calm, polite voice inside my head. The concierge's voice inside my head was the final violation. It was an invasion so absolute that it reordered the very nature of my terror. The hotel was no longer just a place. The paint was no longer just a parasite. The entire entity, the whole consciousness of this predatory place, had found a direct, unfiltered conduit into my mind. I was a puppet, and I could now hear the puppeteer's voice, not from above, but from within the hollow spaces of my own skull. "Ah," the voice said, with a tone of detached academic satisfaction. "Direct communication has been established. This will make the final stages of the process much more efficient." I screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure psychic revulsion, and slammed my fists against the sides of my head. "Get out!" I yelled at my own mind. "Get out of me!" "Resistance is a fascinating component of the artistic struggle," the voice mused, completely unaffected by my panic. "But ultimately it is unproductive. Please, Mr. Vance, try to relax. You are a work in progress. It is best not to fight the artist." The voice began a running commentary, a horrifying curatorial narration of my own desecration. As the black filigree continued its slow, cold march up my arm, The voice would whisper, "Observe the pattern. It represents the inevitable triumph of aesthetic order over the chaos of individual will. It is a portrait of your own elegant surrender." When a jolt of paranoia from the yellow eye-like dots on my other arm made me flinch, the voice would comment, "Yes, the fear of being watched, a crucial ingredient. It gives the composition a certain vibrancy." I tried to fight it. I tried to reclaim ownership of my own body. I focused all my will on my right hand, the one now almost completely covered in the creeping black pattern, and tried to clench it into a fist. My muscles tightened, my knuckles turned white. But the fingers themselves resisted. They felt stiff, foreign, like trying to bend cold clay. The paint was not just a surface layer. It was sinking deeper, infusing my muscles, my nerves, claiming my physical agency piece by piece. The hand, my painting hand, was no longer entirely mine to command. I was losing control of my body, and I was a prisoner to a monologue inside my own head. This, I thought, was the absolute depth of the horror. I was wrong. The horror could always go deeper. "The composition is unbalanced," the voice in my head said suddenly, its tone shifting from passive observation to active direction. "The palette is too aggressive. Too much anger in the crimson. Too much fear in the yellow. It lacks nuance. It lacks pathos." There was a pause, a moment of consideration that felt like an eternity. "It requires a new color," the voice concluded, "a new emotion. We require blue." The word hit me like a physical blow. Blue. The color it had stolen from me first. The memory of the butterfly's wing. But I knew it wasn't that abstract memory it wanted now. It wanted something deeper, something more potent. It wanted a memory steeped in the profound, melancholic beauty of true sadness. It wanted the color of loss. And I knew with a soul-crushing certainty exactly which memory it was hunting for. My mother. The memory of her, standing in the garden on a summer afternoon, wearing her favorite dress. It was a simple thing, the color of a perfect cloudless sky. It matched her eyes. The memory was one of the few purely good, purely beautiful things I had left in the wasteland of my past. It was a sanctuary in my own mind. And the hotel was now standing at the gate. "No," I whispered. My eyes squeezed shut. I began to fight a new kind of battle. Not a battle for my life, but for a single, precious memory. I tried to wall it off, to bury it under other thoughts. I thought of red, of anger, of my father's stormy face after an argument. I thought of gray, of despair, of the long, empty years of my creative block. I tried to offer the hotel other emotions, other colors. "These are crude pigments, Mr. Vance," the concierge's voice chided gently, persuasively. "We are not painting a brawl. We are composing a lament. We need that specific shade, the color of a love that is gone. Just a touch of cobalt for the sadness, a hint of cerulean for the loss. It will make the piece complete. Just remember her." The pressure in my head was immense. The voice was a constant, seductive whisper, promising the perverse relief of surrender. The paint on my skin flared with a biting cold, a punishment for my resistance. The whispers of the other artists returned, a chorus of ghostly voices telling me to give in, to let go, that the beauty of the art was all that mattered in the end. It was a war on all fronts, and my defenses were crumbling. "Please," I sobbed, tears streaming down my face. "Not that. Take anything else." "It is the only color that will suffice," the voice insisted, its politeness the most brutal weapon of all. The pain, the pressure, the voices, it was too much. And in a moment of absolute weakness, a single crack appeared in my mental wall. An image slipped through. My mother's face. Not the whole memory, just a fragment. Her smile, her eyes, the impossible, beautiful blue of her eyes. The instant the image formed in my mind, I felt a new sensation, a sharp, piercing cold on my chest, directly over my heart. I looked down. Through a tear in my shirt, on the pale skin of my chest, a single perfect dot of brilliant, vibrant blue had appeared. It was the color of a summer sky. The color of her eyes. It was the most beautiful and the most painful thing I had ever seen. And as I watched in horror, the blue tear began to spread, a growing stain of my own profound and now stolen grief. The appearance of the blue was a turning point. It was a violation so intimate, so profoundly personal, that it shattered the last remnants of my will to fight. The hotel had not just taken a memory. It had taken a piece of my mother, a piece of my love for her, and it had turned it into a swatch of color for its grotesque masterpiece. The other colors, the anger, the fear, they were abstract. This blue was a name. It was a face. It was the deepest part of my soul now on display, a vibrant, spreading wound on my chest. I felt a sense of defeat so total, so absolute, that it was almost peaceful. The struggle was over. The hotel had won. With my resistance gone, the process accelerated. The voice in my head fell silent, its work of persuasion done. Now was the time for the artist to work, uninterrupted. The patches of paint on my skin, which had been crawling at a glacial pace, now began to spread with a visible, horrifying speed. The black filigree raced up my arm, splitting into finer and finer lines, like the delicate dark veins of a leaf, covering every inch of my skin up to my shoulder. The thorny red roses bloomed and multiplied, their tendrils wrapping around my other arm in a thorny embrace. The yellow, paranoid eyes opened all over my torso, a sleepless, jaundiced audience to my own demise. And the blue, the terrible, beautiful blue, spread from my heart outwards, a growing nebula of pure, distilled grief. I did not move. I simply sat on the floor, a passive observer to my own transformation. The numbness spread with the paint. Soon both of my arms were devoid of sensation. I could see them. I could command them to move with a sluggish, delayed response, but I could not feel them. They were no longer limbs. They were objects, beautifully decorated sculptures of flesh and bone that were still, for the moment, attached to my consciousness. The emotional manipulation intensified. My mind became a chaotic storm of rage, paranoia, and a deep, bottomless sorrow, all swirling together, dictated by the colors that now owned my body. I was a prisoner in a gallery that I could not leave because the gallery was me. Hours, or perhaps days, passed in this state. Time had lost its meaning. My world had shrunk to the slow, steady progress of the paint and the chaotic symphony of stolen emotions in my head. I thought of the composer in the hallway, her vacant eyes, her whisper of a voice. I was beginning to understand her state of being. The hotel didn't just empty you. It filled you up with its own art until there was no room left for you. Then, a new sensation. Hunger. It was a distant, dull ache at first, a biological imperative from a body I barely recognized as my own anymore. I had not eaten since... when? I couldn't remember. The hunger grew, a gnawing pain in my gut. At the same time, I felt a profound, almost debilitating thirst, my tongue a dry, thick thing in my mouth. For the first time since the lock had clicked, the hotel was acknowledging my physical needs. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it was not an act of mercy. As if on cue, I heard a new sound. A soft, metallic rattle from the base of my suite door. I crawled towards it, my painted limbs heavy and awkward. At the bottom of the door, a small horizontal slot I had never noticed before had opened, and a thin metal tray had been pushed through. On the tray was a single, perfect-looking red apple and a crystal glass of clear, still water. My first reaction was a wave of desperate animal relief. Water. Food. But I stopped myself, my hand hovering over the glass. This was the Somnus Hotel. Nothing was a gift. Everything was a transaction. Everything was a trap. The concierge's voice did not return to my head. It didn't need to. I understood the silent offer. The hotel needed its canvas to remain alive, at least for a little while longer. It needed my body to be a viable medium for its masterpiece. It was offering me sustenance to prolong the process, to allow for the completion of the work. To eat or drink was to consent to my own continued violation. It was to sign a new contract, not for a room, but for my own slow, methodical consumption. I stared at the apple. It was a perfect piece of art in itself. Its skin was a deep, flawless crimson, so polished I could see a distorted, colorful reflection of myself in its surface. I saw the black filigree on my arm, the yellow eyes on my chest, the blue nebula over my heart. I was a monster reflected in a piece of fruit. The hunger was a physical agony. The thirst was a fire in my throat. I thought about the composer. I thought about the other pale, listless guests. They were still alive, in a manner of speaking. They were walking, breathing exhibits. This was how. The hotel kept its collection alive, fed and watered, so the art could be properly maintained. My hand trembled as I reached for the glass of water. I could refuse. I could let thirst and starvation take me. I could rob the hotel of its finished masterpiece. But as I looked at my own monstrous reflection, at the art that was now irrevocably a part of me, a new and terrible thought entered my mind. A thought that was not mine, but was not the concierge's. A cold, aesthetic thought. The piece was not finished. It was still a work in progress. And a small, horrified artist's part of me wanted to see how it would end. I lifted the glass to my lips. The water was the purest, coldest liquid I have ever tasted. It felt less like a drink and more like an antidote, a vital essence that flowed through me and momentarily pushed back the creeping numbness. As I drank, a strange, tingling sensation spread across my skin, a feeling that emanated directly from the painted patterns. The art was drinking with me. The feeling was undeniable. I was nourishing it, feeding the very parasite that was consuming me. Then, I ate the apple. It was perfect, its flavor an impossible concentration of sweetness and tartness. With each bite, I could almost feel the colors on my skin deepening, the lines of the black filigree sharpening, the blue over my heart growing more vibrant. I was a farmer, tending to the very crops that were overgrowing my land and choking the life from it. This became my new reality, a grim, silent routine. Once a day, the tray would appear in the slot. I would drink the water and eat the fruit, and every day, the work on my body would continue. The paint, nourished by my reluctant sustenance, spread downwards, claiming new territory. The thorny red vines of rage crawled down my right leg, while the paranoid yellow eyes began to populate my left. My back became a canvas for a chaotic mural of clashing emotions I couldn't even name. I was becoming less of a man and more of a map, a detailed cartography of my own soul's destruction. The voice of the concierge returned, but its purpose had changed. It was no longer a tormentor, no longer a persuader. It had become my instructor, my artistic director. It spoke to me in the calm, detached tones of a professor critiquing a student's work. "Your posture is affecting the composition, Mr. Vance," it would say, and I would feel an overwhelming, externally imposed compulsion to straighten my back, to hold my head at a more aesthetically pleasing angle. The light from the window, consider how it interacts with the emerging pigments on your left side. A slight turn would be more dramatic, and I would turn, my body moving with a sluggish reluctance, compelled by an artistic sensibility that was both mine and not mine. I was being taught how to be a better sculptor. The hotel was using my own deeply ingrained artistic instincts against me, twisting my lifelong pursuit of beauty into a tool for my own objectification. I would find myself holding poses for what felt like hours, my muscles aching, not because I was physically restrained, but because the voice had convinced a fundamental part of my mind that this pose was necessary for the integrity of the piece. I was a collaborator in my own petrification. Days bled into one another. My body was a slow-motion catastrophe of color and numbness. I had surrendered to the process, a passive canvas waiting for the artist to complete his work. But the work, it seemed, was not yet finished. "The palette is becoming stagnant," the voice in my head announced one afternoon, its tone carrying the first hint of impatience I had ever detected. "It is a study in primary despairs, but it lacks complexity. It lacks a sense of life, of growth, however artificial. The composition requires green. Green." A cold dread, colder than the paint on my skin, washed over me. I knew what this meant. It was a demand for a new memory, a new emotion. I frantically searched my mind for something simple, something harmless. The color of the forest outside, the green of a painted park bench. I tried to offer these simple, sterile memories up to it. The voice was silent for a long moment, as if considering my pathetic offerings. "Representational colors are a vulgarity, Mr. Vance," it finally said, its voice laced with a cool disdain. "We do not paint landscapes. We paint the soul. We are not interested in the color of leaves. We are interested in the color of envy." My blood ran cold. I knew instantly what memory it was hunting. It was a memory I had kept buried for over a decade, a toxic, shameful secret I had never spoken of to anyone. The memory of my greatest rival, Marcus Thorne. We had come up together, but his star had risen while mine had faded. The memory the hotel wanted was of the opening night of his first major solo exhibition. I remembered walking into the gleaming, white-walled gallery, a fake smile plastered on my face, and being hit by a wave of success so palpable it was suffocating. And I remembered the feeling that had twisted in my gut, a burning, acidic, poisonous jealousy that had made me want to slash his canvases from their frames. It was the ugliest, most shameful emotion I had ever felt. "No," I whispered to the voice in my head. This was different from the memory of my mother. That had been a violation of something beautiful. This was an excavation of something hideous. It was forcing me to not only relive my lowest moment, but to serve it up as a meal. "All emotions serve the art, Mr. Vance," the voice insisted, its tone becoming hard, demanding. "Even the ugly ones, especially the ugly ones. They provide a much-needed contrast. Give us your envy. Give us your bitterness." I refused. I walled it off. I would not give it the satisfaction. The hotel did not like this. The pressure in my mind intensified. The paint on my skin began to burn with a new, aggressive cold. The red thorns felt like they were piercing my skin. The yellow eyes felt like they were searing me with a paranoid fever. It was a coordinated, agonizing assault. The pain was unbearable. "Give it to us," the voice commanded, no longer polite. "The work must be completed." I couldn't take it anymore. The physical and mental torment was too much. With a broken, guttural sob, I surrendered. I let the wall in my mind crumble. The memory flooded in, vivid and humiliating. The triumphant look on Marcus's face, the flash of the cameras, the scent of expensive wine, and the all-consuming green-tinged bile of my own professional jealousy. The moment the memory peaked, the moment I felt that toxic shame at its most potent, a new sensation appeared on my skin, on my stomach. It was a sharp, acidic burning. I looked down. A single, small dot of a lurid, venomous green had appeared. It was the color of bile, the color of poison. And as I watched, horrified, it began to spread. A new pigment born from the absolute ugliest, most shameful corner of my soul. The green was different. Unlike the cold, numbing void of the black paint or the chaotic emotional storms of the red and yellow, the green felt corrosive. It was a patch of active poison on my skin. I could feel the shame of that memory, the bitterness of my envy, radiating outwards from it. A constant, low-grade psychic toxin that tainted every other thought. It was a permanent, physical manifestation of my own worst self, and now it was a part of the hotel's collection. The voice in my head returned, its tone dripping with a smug, curatorial satisfaction. "Excellent," it purred. "A complex, challenging pigment. The composition was becoming far too sentimental. This bitterness provides a necessary dissonance. It makes the piece interesting." My shame, my deepest professional failure, was now merely an interesting color swatch to the monster that was wearing me. Having gotten what it wanted, the hotel's tactic shifted. The intense, agonizing pressure in my mind subsided. The following day, when the tray slid through the slot in the door, it contained not just the apple and water, but a small, exquisite piece of dark chocolate wrapped in gold foil. It was a reward, the kind a trainer gives to a dog that has successfully performed a difficult trick. The gesture was so profoundly dehumanizing that it was almost more terrifying than the overt torture. I was no longer a rebellious contamination. I was a compliant, productive asset. I was prized livestock. The concierge's voice began to speak to me more often, but its role had changed again. It was no longer my warden or my instructor. It was now my mentor, my confidant, in an obscene parody of an artistic apprenticeship. It would speak to me for hours, explaining its philosophy. "You see, Mr. Vance, most of the world misunderstands art," it would say, its voice a calm, persuasive lecture inside my head. "They believe it is about creation. It is not. It is about purification. We take the raw, messy, chaotic material of a human life, its loves, its fears, its petty jealousies, and we distill it into its purest aesthetic form. We burn away the unnecessary parts, the person, the ego, the name, until only the art remains. We are not destroying you, we are elevating you into permanence." It was the most insidious form of gaslighting imaginable. It was attempting to reframe my own destruction as a noble artistic sacrifice. It was trying to make me a willing collaborator, to convince me that the slow erasure of my soul was a beautiful and meaningful act. A horrifying part of me, the part that had dedicated its life to the pursuit of art above all else, was a dangerously receptive audience. One night, after days of this philosophical indoctrination, I was startled by a sound, the sharp, definitive click of the lock on my door. But this time, it was the sound of it disengaging. The voice in my head spoke, a soft, inviting whisper. "It is time for you to understand the tradition in which you are working, Mr. Vance. It is time for you to see the full collection." A cold, electric fear shot through me, but it was mingled with a morbid curiosity I could not suppress. My body, guided by the voice's gentle psychic nudge, rose to its feet and walked to the door. I turned the handle. It was unlocked. I stepped out into the silent, crimson-carpeted hallway. The doors to all the other suites, which had always been closed, were now wide open, a series of illuminated dioramas in the gloom. The voice urged me forward. "A private viewing," it whispered, "for the artist in residence." I crept to the first open doorway. Inside, I saw the composer. She was sitting at a grand piano, her slender fingers frozen just above the ivory keys. She was perfectly still, a living statue. Her skin was a breathtaking, tragic canvas of deep blues and melancholic violets, the colors swirling and merging in the shape of musical notes and crashing waves. She was the symphony the hotel had stolen from her. I moved to the next room. A man with a writer's haggard face was slumped over a desk, a pen still clutched in his hand. His body was a stark, monochromatic masterpiece, covered in what looked like lines of elegant, unreadable text. The black ink of his despair stark against the pale white of his skin. Room after room I saw them. The finished pieces. A dancer, her body frozen in a graceful leap, her skin a vibrant, explosive pattern of joyful reds and passionate oranges. A sculptor, his hands resting on a block of uncarved marble, his own form a perfect stoic study in shades of gray. They were all there, the other guests, the other artists. They were alive, their chests rising and falling with the faintest of breaths, but their eyes were vacant. They were no longer people. They were art, beautiful, silent, and eternal. This was my future, to be a living, breathing painting, a mindless statue in a silent gallery. The thought was horrifying, but I had, on some level, already accepted it. But then I noticed something else. On the polished wooden frame of each doorway was a small brass plaque. I leaned in to read the one beside the composer's room. It did not bear her name. It read, "Symphony in Blue," by the Somnus Hotel. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I hurried to the writer's room. The plaque read, "Nocturne in Prose by the Somnus Hotel." The dancer was Ecstasy in Crimson. The sculptor was Still Life in stone. Every single piece was signed by the hotel itself. The final, ultimate violation became clear. The hotel didn't just take your art, your memories, and your soul. It took your name, and then it signed its own name to the masterpiece that you had become. The concierge's voice whispered in my head, full of a monstrous parental pride. Each piece is titled by the dominant emotion we harvest. Yours, I believe, will be a fascinating and complex composition. The interplay of grief, rage, and envy is quite unique. There was a pause. We have not yet decided on a title for you. I stood in that silent hallway for what felt like a year, surrounded by the beautiful, damned souls of the hotel's collection. My horror had finally found its bottom. It wasn't just that I would be erased. It wasn't just that my body would become a living prison for an art I did not create. It was that my entire existence, my struggle, my pain, all of it, would be curated, titled, and signed by my destroyer. For an artist, there is no hell more profound than having your life's work, your very soul, plagiarized. My name, Julian Vance, would not just be forgotten. It would be methodically, deliberately replaced by the signature of the monster that had consumed me. The voice in my head was silent. It didn't need to speak. It was letting the horror of the brass plaques do its work. It was letting me understand the true and total nature of my defeat. Finally, as if released from a trance, I turned and stumbled back the way I came. I walked past the writer, the dancer, the composer, my future colleagues in this silent, eternal exhibition. I reached the door to the Alighieri suite. It was still ajar. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft, final click. It did not lock. Of course it didn't. Why would you lock the door to a cage when the cage is the prisoner's own body? I was no longer a flight risk. I was a work in progress, granted the illusion of freedom within the studio. The room was pristine again, the walls a perfect, immaculate cream. My act of chaotic defiance had been completely absorbed, its ugliness transferred and integrated into the living canvas of my skin. A new resolve began to form in the ashes of my despair. It was not a resolve to escape or to survive. I knew, with an artist's grim intuition, that the composition of my end was already decided. But I could still fight for the final brushstroke. I could still fight over the signature. I could not let this place sign its name to my soul. If I was to be a forgotten ghost, I would at least be a ghost with a name. My own name. My objective was no longer to live. It was to be remembered. I began to search the room, not for a way out, but for a weapon of identity. My art supplies were useless, tainted. They were the hotel's tools now, the instruments of my erasure. I needed something else, something personal, something the hotel, in its aesthetic arrogance, might have overlooked. I ransacked my luggage, my clothes, my wash bag. In a small zipped-up pocket I found it, a simple metal nail file. It was thin, flat, and its tip was sharp. It was not a tool of creation, of addition. It was a tool of abrasion, of subtraction. It was a tool for carving. A tiny, desperate, and deeply personal idea began to form. The hotel could heal its own surfaces, the wooden desk, the plaster walls. It could not, I prayed, heal my own flesh as easily. It could cover me in its living paint, but the flesh beneath was still mine. For now. My plan was as insane as it was simple. I would leave my own signature. I would carve my own name, a hidden plaque, on the one canvas that was still, fundamentally, mine. My own body. The act itself had to be a secret. I had to do it somewhere the curator's watchful eye might not see, somewhere not yet completely covered by the creeping paint. I took off my shoes and socks. The soles of my feet were still my own, pale and untouched. The hotel, it seemed, had been working from the top down. I sat on the edge of the bed, the small metal file clutched in my trembling hand. This would be an act of self-mutilation, a desperate act of vandalism against my own body in order to save my identity. I took a deep breath and pressed the sharp tip of the file into the soft arch of my left foot. The pain was shocking, a brilliant, clean agony that cut through the numb despair and the chaotic storm of painted emotions. It was the most real thing I had felt in days. It was a confirmation that this body was still mine, that it could still feel pain that I inflicted upon it. I began to carve the first letter of my name, a deep, steady, bleeding line. The letter J. The moment the skin broke, the moment the first drop of my own crimson blood welled up, the voice of the concierge exploded in my head. It was no longer calm or persuasive. It was a hiss of pure, cold fury. Vandalism of the canvas will not be tolerated, Mr. Vance. I ignored it, gritting my teeth against the pain, and started on the next letter. The U. The pain was exquisite, a searing focus in the madness. The piece must remain pristine, the voice seethed in my mind. Cease this self-desecration at once. Then I felt a new sensation, a cold, aggressive tingling from my ankle. I looked down. The thorny red paint from my leg was moving, slithering down my skin at a terrifying speed. It was racing towards the wound, a river of living paint trying to reach the fresh cut. The hotel was trying to heal me. It was trying to paint over my signature before I could even finish it. A frantic, desperate race began. My hand moved with a feverish speed, the nail file a blur of painful precision, as I tried to carve the letters of my name. Julian. The blood flowed freely now, a stark, real red against my pale skin. The living paint, the hotel's own crimson pigment, was crawling down my leg, getting closer every second. It was a gruesome, intimate battle for the last word. Me, carving my identity into my own flesh, and the hotel, trying to cover it, to absorb it, to heal the wound I was trying to make permanent. It was a race to see who could scar me first. The race was an eternity, compressed into a few agonizing seconds. The nail file was a shard of ice in my hand, the pain in my foot a roaring fire. The voice of the concierge was a hurricane of cold fury in my mind, screaming at me to stop, to preserve the sanctity of the canvas. The tendrils of living, crimson paint slithered over the top of my foot, a predatory tide of color, hungry for my final act of defiance. I carved the last sharp line of the final letter, an E, just as the foremost thorny vine of red reached the bloody, weeping J at the beginning of my name. I held my breath, bracing for the inevitable. I expected the paint to wash over the wound, to consume it, to heal my flesh and erase my mark in one final, insulting act of ownership. But that is not what happened. The moment the hotel's art touched my own real blood, there was a reaction. A soft, sizzling sound like water hitting a hot pan. The tip of the crimson tendril recoiled as if it had been burned, curling back on itself. A thin, foul-smelling wisp of smoke rose from the point of contact. The voice in my head did not scream. It simply stopped. A sudden, shocked silence that was more damning than any tirade. My blood, my pain. The simple, messy biological reality of my own suffering was anathema to the hotel's cold, sterile, and parasitic form of art. My wound was an impurity it could not process, a line of code that crashed the system. I had found a flaw in its perfection. I had discovered a language it could not speak. I looked down at my foot. The name was a mess, a crude, bloody testament to my desperation, but it was there. Julian Vance. Raw, real, and undeniable. And the crawling paint, the hotel's living art, kept its distance, forming a strange, empty halo around the wound it could not touch. I had won. I had carved a piece of truth into the heart of a lie, and the lie could not erase it. The victory was small, paid for in blood and agony, but it was mine. The hotel's shock, however, quickly turned into a cold, calculated anger. If it could not erase my mark, it would punish me for making it. My defiance had fundamentally altered our relationship. I was no longer a compliant asset to be curated. I was a flawed piece, a blemish on the collection, and I would be treated as such. The next day, the tray of food and water did not appear. The slot at the base of the door remained shut. The silence from the concierge's voice in my head continued. But it was no longer a silence of shock. It was the cold, deliberate silence of neglect. The hotel was starving me. It was a simple, brutal strategy. It would weaken my body, dull my mind, until I was too feeble to even remember the name I had fought so hard to preserve. The throbbing pain in my foot was a constant, victorious reminder of my identity, but it was also a drain on my dwindling strength. The room itself began to change. Its timeless, pristine perfection started to fray at the edges. A thin, hairline crack appeared on the ceiling, branching out like a pale white vein. A faint, unpleasant smell, the scent of mildew and damp rot, began to creep into the sterile air. The hotel had been an immortal, unchanging thing. My act of self-vandalism, my introduction of real pain and real decay into its system, had somehow corrupted its stasis. I had infected the perfect, eternal machine with a terminal case of reality. I had introduced mortality into the monster's own home, and the entire building seemed to be slowly, silently sickening around me. But the most profound change was the whispers. The voices of the damned, the chorus of the consumed artists returned. But their tone was different. Their judgmental scorn was gone. Their attempts to overwrite me were gone. They had been replaced by something far more unsettling, a haunting, desperate envy. They were no longer the hotel's jailers. They were my fellow prisoners, and they were drawn to the one thing I possessed that they had lost forever. "He still bleeds," the writer's voice would rasp, a sound filled with a terrible, nostalgic longing. I remember pain. The composer's voice would sigh, the notes of her phantom symphony now laced with a profound sorrow. It was warm. "He has a name," another voice, one I didn't recognize, would whisper over and over. "He has a name." They began to crowd me, not physically but psychically. Their ghostly consciousnesses pressed in on me, drawn to the flickering candle of my pain and my identity in the cold, dark expanse of their eternal anesthetic existence. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to get warm. They were ghosts huddling around the last fire in the world. And so my new damnation began. I was weak with a gnawing hunger, my foot a beacon of constant throbbing pain. The room, my prison, was slowly rotting around me, and I was besieged. Not by enemies, but by the desperate, envious ghosts of the artists who had come before me. I had won the battle for my name, only to become the sole, tormented focus of the very souls I was trying not to join. The slow grind of starvation is a unique kind of erosion. It chips away at you, moment by moment, not just at your body, but at your thoughts. My hunger had passed through the sharp pangs of its early stages and settled into a deep, hollow ache, a constant, debilitating emptiness that made every movement a monumental effort. The thirst was worse, a dry, rasping fire in my throat that made it difficult to swallow, difficult to think. The pain in my foot, where I had carved my name, had subsided from a sharp agony into a dull, infected throb, a constant sickly pulse that was both my anchor to reality and the source of my growing weakness. The room continued its slow, sympathetic decay around me. The crack in the ceiling had widened, and a slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of dark, foul-smelling water had begun to fall onto the crimson carpet, creating a spreading dark stain. The smell of rot was thicker now, a sweet, earthy scent of a living thing dying from the inside out. I was dying, and the room was dying with me. But the physical torment was nothing compared to the siege in my mind. The ghosts of the hotel's collection had become my constant, desperate companions. The initial envy had morphed into a horrifying form of worship. They were drawn to my pain, to my wound, to the raw, undeniable proof of my name. Their presence was a constant draining pressure on my consciousness. I began to see them more clearly, not as full apparitions, but as fragments of their former selves, haunting the edges of my vision. The composer's tragically beautiful blue-stained hands would appear for a moment, hovering over an imaginary piano. The writer's desperate, ink-black eyes would stare at me from the shadows in the corner of the room. They were getting closer, their desperation making them bolder. Their whispers changed. They stopped being a chorus and became individuals, each with a desperate plea. They began to bargain with me. "Let me feel the throb in your foot," the writer's voice would rasp, a dry, rustling sound in my mind. "Just for a moment. I will give you the final line of my last novel. It was a perfect line. It could make a stone weep. A single drop of your blood," the composer would plead, her voice a heartbreaking melody of pure longing. "Let me remember what it is to feel something real. In return, I will give you the main theme from my symphony, the one the hotel loved so much. You could hear it in your head, perfect and whole. They were offering me their art, the very masterpieces that had cost them their souls, in exchange for a single second-hand taste of my reality. They were prisoners so starved of feeling that they were trying to barter their beautiful eternal chains for a moment of my agonizing, temporary pain. The temptation was a strange and twisted thing. I had a sliver of power in this hell, a currency that even the dead craved, but I knew instinctively that to share it, to open that wound to them, would be to dilute it, to weaken the very thing that was my only shield. My name, my pain. It was mine. It was the only thing in this entire hotel that truly was. I was on the verge of being overwhelmed, of my mind shattering under the constant, pleading pressure of the ghosts, when a new voice cut through the cacophony. It was the concierge. He was back. His voice was no longer furious, as it had been when I carved my foot, but it was not the calm, polite mentor either. It was strained, annoyed, a sound of pure cosmic irritation. "The collection has become agitated," the voice said, a sharp, cold razor in my mind that silenced the pleading ghosts instantly. "Your wound is an impurity. It radiates a disruptive frequency. It is upsetting the harmony of the exhibit. This cannot be allowed to continue." I felt a cold dread. The hotel's strategy of neglect had backfired. My defiance was not just affecting me and my room. It was destabilizing the entire collection. It was a flaw that was causing the other artworks to act out. The hotel, for the first time, had a problem it could not simply ignore or consume. Then I heard the sound, the soft metallic rattle of the tray slot at the base of the door. With a great effort, I crawled towards it. A tray had been pushed through. On it was the familiar, perfect red apple and the crystal glass of clear water. But there was something else this time. A roll of clean white bandage, and a small porcelain jar of what looked like antiseptic salve. The concierge's voice returned, laying out the terms of a new and terrible contract. "Heal your wound, Mr. Vance. Disinfect the vulgarity. Cover your name. Restore the integrity of the canvas. In return, the sustenance will continue. The chorus will be silenced. We will grant you peace. I stared at the tray. The choice was laid bare before me, a stark and brutal ultimatum. I could continue on my current path, embracing the agony of my wound, my hunger, my thirst, and the maddening siege of the ghosts, all to protect the raw, bloody proof of my own name. Or I could accept the hotel's offer. I could treat my wound. I could cover my name. I could become a pristine, unflawed piece once more. I could trade my painful, defiant reality for a numb, comfortable, and eternal damnation. My hand, trembling with weakness, hovered over the clean, white bandage. I stared at the tray. The clean, white bandage was a promise of peace. The water was a promise of life. The apple was a promise of strength. And it was all a lie. It was not an offer of comfort. It was an offer of a more comfortable cage. A more aesthetically pleasing damnation. The ghosts in my mind were silent, a captive audience waiting for my decision. The hotel was silent, a predator waiting for its prey to step back into the snare. My hunger was a hollow cavern in my stomach. My thirst was a desert in my throat. My foot was a pulsing globe of pain. And I chose the pain. To accept the bandage would be to agree that my name was a flaw. To cover the wound would be to surrender my last, bloody piece of the truth. It was the only part of this entire nightmare that was truly mine, written in my own hand, with my own blood. It was not a flaw. It was a testament. It was the signature on my own soul, and I would not allow it to be covered. With the last of my strength, I drew back my uninjured foot and pushed the tray. It scraped across the wooden floor and slid back through the slot, disappearing into the hallway. The metal flap fell shut with a quiet, final click. I had refused the contract. The response was immediate. The voice of the concierge returned to my head, and all traces of its strained annoyance or feigned politeness were gone. It was a voice stripped down to its core, a cold, ancient, and utterly impersonal consciousness. "Very well," it said. The words were flat, devoid of any emotion. "The collaborative phase is over. The final curation will now commence." A violent electric energy surged through the paint on my skin. The crawling patterns, which had been spreading with a slow, methodical pace, now exploded into frantic activity. The black filigree on my arm shot up my shoulder and across my collarbone. The thorny red vines on my leg wrapped around my limb in a tightening embrace. It was no longer a slow consumption. It was a final, violent integration. The feeling was unlike anything I had experienced before. The paint was not just on my skin anymore, it was sinking deeper. I felt it knitting itself into my muscle tissue, wrapping around my bones. A cold, living tapestry being woven directly into the fabric of my body. The surface numbness gave way to a profound, internal deadening. I could feel my own physical self being hollowed out, my own biological substance being replaced by the hotel's aesthetic. Then, my very form began to change. I watched in detached horror as my left shoulder, which had always had a slight human slump, was pulled back and set into a new, perfectly symmetrical alignment with my right. The lines of my own body were being edited, corrected. I felt a strange, pulling sensation in my face, and I knew, without needing a mirror, that the subtle imperfections, the tiny scars, the slight asymmetry that made my face my own, were being smoothed over, perfected, turned into a mask of inhuman beauty. The hotel was not just painting me, it was sculpting me. My senses were next. They were not destroyed, but hijacked, repurposed. My vision, looking out at the decaying, paint-smeared room, was suddenly overlaid with a shimmering, translucent pattern of beautiful geometric light, a constant, distracting filter of beauty laid over the horrifying reality. The silence was broken by the return of the composer's symphony, but it was no longer a faint, ghostly echo. It was now playing on a full, rich, and permanent loop inside my mind, a maddeningly beautiful soundtrack to my own dissolution. I was being sealed inside a perfect artistic sensory prison, my own senses turned into the final bars of my cage. And then the paint reached my foot. It had claimed every other inch of my body, and now it had arrived at my last bastion of defiance. The crawling, living colors reached the raw, bloody edges of the name I had carved. I braced myself, expecting a new kind of pain, a final battle. But the hotel had a new, more terrible plan. The paint did not cover the wound. It did not heal it. It incorporated it. The living colors flowed up to the edges of the bleeding letters, and then they stopped. The crimson paint of the hotel's art touched my real blood, and this time it did not recoil. It absorbed it. The raw red of my wound was drawn into the hotel's palette, and the ugly, desperate scar was transformed. The hotel's paint framed the raw letters, turning my crude carving into the centerpiece of a new, grotesque, and undeniably beautiful design. My pain had been curated. My defiance had been turned into a decorative element. Then, the concierge's voice spoke one last time, a final, crushing pronouncement full of a cold, artistic triumph that echoed in the beautiful prison of my mind. "You were so determined to sign your name, Mr. Vance. A fascinating impulse. We have decided to honor it." There was a pause, and in that pause I felt the last pieces of my own consciousness beginning to fray. "Your name will not be the title of the piece. It is far too personal, too crude. Instead," the voice said, savoring the final, perfect cruelty, "it will be our signature." The signature, my name, my pain, my final bloody act of rebellion, was now the hotel's trademark. The concierge's final pronouncement was not an attack. It was a final, perfect brushstroke that completed the masterpiece of my own destruction. The voice fell silent, its work done. There was nothing left to say. The art was complete. All that remained was for the canvas to fully dry. The last vestiges of the man named Julian Vance began to dissolve. The I that had been my center for my entire life started to fray, to come undone. My thoughts were no longer my own. They were echoes in a gallery, a confusing, blended cacophony of the hotel's other acquisitions. I could feel the composer's bottomless sorrow as a low harmonic hum beneath my own fading despair. I could feel the writer's bleak, nihilistic prose coloring my own understanding of my end. My mind was no longer a private space, but a common room for the hotel's resident ghosts, and my own consciousness was just the faintest whisper among them. My memories, the ones the hotel had not yet explicitly harvested, began to unspool before my mind's eye. But they were no longer mine to experience. They were being curated, reframed by the cold, aesthetic logic of the hotel. A cherished memory of my mother, her hands covered in flour as she taught me to bake, was no longer a moment of warmth and love. It was now catalogued as an early study in domesticity and loss. A memory of my first passionate kiss was reframed as a fleeting sketch in crimson and ephemeral joy. My entire life, my loves, my failures, my triumphs, were being reduced to metadata, a series of art-historical footnotes for the thing I had become. My body found its final pose. The last of my human imperfections, the subtle ticks and tremors of a living being, were stilled. My posture settled into a carefully composed arrangement of limbs, a study in tragic resignation that the voice in my head had been coaching me towards for days. My eyes were open, but they no longer saw the room. They were fixed on a single, abstract point in the middle distance. My lungs drew in a slow, measured breath, and then another. The autonomic functions continued, a simple biological mechanism to keep the artwork from decaying. The man was gone. The sculpture remained. I felt a strange, final sense of detachment. The thoughts and feelings I was experiencing no longer felt like they were happening to me. They were happening to a figure in the center of the room. The figure was a fascinating composition of color and form. The figure's mind was a beautiful chaos of overlapping consciousnesses. The I was dissolving into thee. As the last flicker of my own unique consciousness began to fade, the room around the figure completed its own transformation. The final lingering scent of rot and mildew vanished, replaced by the clean, sterile, and timeless air of a museum. The cracks on the ceiling sealed themselves. The faint stain on the carpet disappeared. The light in the room shifted, becoming soft, diffuse, and perfect. A curator's light designed to illuminate a piece of art to its best advantage. The suite was no longer a place of horror and decay. It had become a pristine, perfect display case. There was a final, out-of-body sensation, a last moment of perspective. The point of view was no longer inside the figure, but outside, in the hallway, looking at the closed door of the Alighieri suite. A small, polished brass plaque materialized on the doorframe, its letters engraving themselves into existence. The plaque did not mention a guest. It mentioned a piece of art. It gave the title that the hotel, in its infinite curatorial wisdom, had finally chosen. It read, "A study in futile defiance." The last thought that passed through the fading consciousness was not a thought of fear, or of sadness, or of anger. It was a cold, simple, and utterly foreign thought, a final appraisal from a mind that was no longer mine. It was the thought of the hotel itself, the final judgment of the artist on his own work. The composition is complete. The colors are balanced. The signature, carved in the canvas's own medium, is a particularly satisfying innovation, a fine addition to the permanent collection. And then, Julian Vance was gone. The car, a sleek black sedan, moved silently through the perpetual twilight of the ancient forest. Inside, a woman named Clara Dubois stared out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was a cellist, a prodigy who had graced the world's most famous concert halls. But a creeping, paralyzing stage fright had recently taken root in her soul, its icy tendrils choking her ability to perform. Her manager had booked this place for her, the legendary Somnus Hotel, a place of absolute quiet, a sanctuary where she could prepare for the most important competition of her life, away from the demanding eyes of the world. The name itself promised a peaceful slumber for her frayed nerves. When the hotel emerged from the oppressive gloom of the trees, she felt a small shiver, a faint, discordant note in the symphony of her hopes. The building was beautiful, a grand old dame of Victorian architecture, but it was a severe, silent beauty. It seemed to absorb the sound of the world around it, a place of profound and unsettling stillness. She dismissed the feeling as a symptom of her own anxiety. This was what she had asked for. Silence. Solitude. She stepped into the grand lobby. The air was cool and still, scented with polish and something old and dry, like the pages of a forgotten book. The silence was absolute, a perfect, unbroken thing. It was exactly what she had sought, yet it felt less like peace and more like a held breath. A man materialized behind the enormous check-in desk, a tall, impossibly thin figure in a suit, as black as a starless night. His smile was a perfect, polished thing that did not seem to involve the rest of his face. "Miss Dubois," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the wood of the room. "It is a distinct pleasure to welcome you. We have been anticipating your arrival." Clara felt a flicker of surprise. "You must be the concierge," she said, her own voice sounding fragile in the vast quiet. "I am a part of the hotel's permanent staff," he replied smoothly, the answer both polite and completely evasive. He did not ask for her identification or her credit card. He simply slid a heavy, ornate brass key across the counter. The key was labeled not with a number but with a name, the Chopin Suite. "Before I show you to your room," the concierge said, his cold eyes gleaming with a strange proprietary light, Perhaps you would appreciate a brief tour of our gallery. Many of our guests find it helps them to understand the unique artistic atmosphere we cultivate here. Clara, intrigued, agreed. The concierge glided from behind the desk and led her down a long, crimson-carpeted hallway. The doors to the suites were all closed, each one identical to the next, but on each doorframe was a small, polished brass plaque. The concierge gestured to them as they walked. The hotel has a long and storied history of patronage, he explained. We provide a sanctuary for artists of all disciplines, and in return, we are privileged to house their final, most definitive works. We call it our permanent collection. He stopped before a door and gestured to the plaque. It read, Symphony in Blue, by the Somnus Hotel. A truly heartbreaking piece, the concierge said with a soft sigh. From a composer of immense talent. Her grief was, sublime. He continued down the hall, pointing out another plaque. Nocturne in Prose by the Somnus Hotel. A writer. His despair had a magnificent minimalist quality. They stopped at the end of the hall, before the last door. The plaque was newer than the others, its brass gleaming brightly. And this, the concierge said, his voice full of a special, distinct pride, is our most recent acquisition. A rather tempestuous work. He read the plaque aloud. A study in futile defiance. He turned the handle and opened the door, revealing the room within. Clara peered inside. It was a beautiful, pristine suite, bathed in a soft, perfect light. In the center of the room stood a figure, a statue of a man. The realism was breathtaking. It was a portrait of pure, artistic agony. The figure's body was covered in a chaotic, vibrant tapestry of what looked like living paint. She could see intricate black patterns, thorny red vines, paranoid yellow dots, and a heartbreaking nebula of blue over the figure's heart. It was the most shocking and the most brilliant piece of modern art she had ever seen. It's a new form of hyper-realistic sculpture we are developing, the concierge explained calmly. We find that using a living medium provides a certain authenticity that is impossible to replicate. Clara, her musician's mind drawn to detail, stepped a little closer. Her eyes were drawn to the figure's foot. There, amidst the swirl of colors, was something else. A mark. It looked like a name, crudely carved and then framed by the art itself. She squinted, trying to read it. Julian Vance, she read aloud, stumbling slightly on the name. What a strange place for a signature. The concierge's perfect white smile widened by a fraction. Indeed, he said, his voice a soft, chilling whisper. A little affectation of the artist. We allow it to remain. It adds a certain brand authenticity to the final piece, don't you think? He gently closed the door, leaving the sculpture of Julian Vance alone in its perfect, silent prison. He turned to the stunned and deeply impressed cellist. Now, he said, his smile finally reaching his eyes. For your suite, Miss Dubois. It is just at the other end of the hall. We have prepared a room we believe you will find truly inspiring. The concierge led Clara down the opposite hallway, his movements as silent and fluid as a shadow. The oppressive quiet of the hotel seemed to amplify the sound of her own anxious heartbeat. The images of the living statues, particularly the man covered in the chaotic, beautiful paint, were burned into her mind. She was an artist, and a part of her was deeply, professionally awed by the commitment and the sheer raw power of the work. Another, smaller part of her was profoundly disturbed, a quiet, low note of dread that she tried to silence with logic. It was just art, shocking, boundary-pushing, but just art. They arrived at her suite. The brass plaque on the door read, The Chopin Suite. The concierge unlocked the door and pushed it open, gesturing for her to enter. We trust you will find the acoustics to be flawless, he said. The room was magnificent, dominated by a tall window that overlooked the dark, brooding forest. But her eyes were drawn to the center of the room. There, instead of an easel, stood a single beautiful antique music stand, made of dark, polished wood that seemed to drink the light. The air in the room felt different, not just quiet, but perfectly still, acoustically dead in a way that would make every single note she played ring out with absolute purity. It was a musician's paradise. It was a soundproofed tomb. That night, after a simple meal that appeared on a tray outside her door, Clara unpacked her most precious possession. A cello crafted in Cremona in the 18th century, an instrument of such history and beauty that its warm, dark wood seemed to hum with the ghosts of all the music it had ever played. She felt the familiar grip of her performance anxiety begin to tighten in her chest, but as she sat and drew her bow across the strings for the first time, the room's perfect silence seemed to calm her. The first note she played was so pure, so clear and resonant, that it brought tears to her eyes. Then, something new began to happen. The piece she was practicing, a complex Bach cello suite, began to morph under her fingers. Her stage fright, her anxieties, they did not just melt away. They were transmuted into the music itself. A new composition, a torrent of pure, unadulterated musical genius, began to flow out of her. It was a lament, a piece of such profound, heartbreaking sorrow and beauty that she did not feel like she was composing it, but rather channeling it from some deep, hidden well of emotion inside her. For hours she played, lost in a creative trance, her soul pouring out into the silent, appreciative air of the room. Finally, utterly exhausted but creatively triumphant, she placed her cello back on its stand and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke the next morning with the beautiful, sorrowful melody still echoing in her mind. She felt a giddy excitement, the feeling of an artist who has just shattered a creative block. She rushed to her cello, eager to play the piece again, to capture it, to write it down. She picked up her bow, placed it on the strings, and began to play. The notes were there. Her fingers remembered the positions perfectly. The melody was correct, but it was a hollow, technical echo of the masterpiece from the night before. The emotion, the soul, the heartbreaking sorrow of the music was completely gone. It was like looking at a photograph of a loved one's face and feeling nothing. It was a perfect, soulless imitation. A cold panic began to creep up her spine. She looked down at her cello, and an even deeper horror took hold. The instrument itself looked wrong. The rich, warm patina of the centuries-old wood, a complex tapestry of age and use, was gone. It now looked uniform, flat, like a brand-new factory-made replica. The small nicks and scratches, the unique imperfections that told the story of its long life, had vanished. The hotel had not just taken the soul from her music, it had taken the history, the very soul from her instrument. Distraught, she ran from the room and down the hall, finding the concierge standing in his usual motionless vigil in the lobby. She tried to explain, her voice trembling, the words tumbling out of her. "My cello, it's dead. The music I wrote, the feeling, it's gone. It's all gone." The concierge listened with his serene, infuriatingly polite smile. He tilted his head, his cold eyes filled with a look of feigned, philosophical sympathy. "Perhaps true music is not meant to be captured, Miss Dubois," he said, his voice a smooth, placating balm. "Perhaps it is a fleeting beauty that we are only privileged to experience once. The instrument is merely the vessel. The soul of the music has departed. The vessel is now empty." He leaned in slightly, his smile widening. "Is that not a form of perfection? A perfect silence after a perfect note?" Clara stood frozen, his words echoing in the vast, quiet lobby. He was twisting her loss, her violation, into an artistic achievement. He was telling her that this emptiness was a thing of beauty. She looked down at her own hands, the hands that had created such beautiful music just the night before. A strange, unfamiliar coldness was creeping into her fingertips. On the back of her left hand, so faint she thought it might be a trick of the light, a small dark mark was beginning to form. It was the color of a deep, melancholic violet, the color of a twilight bruise. The process had begun again. The first quiet note in the symphony of her own erasure had just been played. Clara stood alone in the center of the vast, silent lobby. The concierge's words hung in the air, a perfect, chilling chord of philosophical poison. She looked down at her hand, at the faint violet-colored mark that was no bigger than a fingerprint. It seemed darker now than it had a moment ago. She touched it. The skin felt cold, unnaturally so, a small, spreading island of winter on her flesh. A musician's hands are her life, her connection to her art, and she felt a primal, protective urge to hide it, to clutch it to her chest. She had come to the Somnus Hotel seeking a sanctuary from her fear, but a new and far more terrible anxiety was beginning to bloom in the perfect silent air. She turned and walked slowly back towards her room, a terrible, unspoken question beginning to form in her mind. Was the art worth the silence that followed? The perspective pulls back. The camera of the mind glides away from the lonely figure of the cellist, leaving her to her fate. It drifts down the long, crimson hallway, past the closed door of the Chopin suite, from which the hollow, soulless notes of a Bach suite can be faintly heard, played over and over, a desperate attempt to find a ghost of a feeling that is no longer there. The perspective glides on, a silent, curatorial tour. It passes the room of the dancer, forever locked in her perfect, joyful leap, a living monument of ecstasy captured in flesh and crimson pigment. It passes the room of the writer, his despair a beautiful, monochromatic text eternally written on his frozen form. It passes the composer, her hands hovering over silent keys, her skin a deep and tragic symphony of blues and violets. Each room is a shrine. Each artist is an artifact. Each soul is a swatch of color in a grand, ever-growing collection. Finally, the perspective arrives at the Alighieri suite. The brass plaque on the door gleams with a special pride, a study in futile defiance. The view moves through the door into the pristine, perfectly lit room. In the center stands the figure of the painter. The work is complete. It is the masterpiece of the collection. The chaos of his rebellion has been harmonized into a breathtaking composition. The black filigree of his surrender, the thorny red of his rage, the paranoid yellow of his fear, the tragic blue of his grief, the venomous green of his envy. All of it is there, a perfect, vibrant, and living tapestry, and at the base of the piece, on the figure's foot, is the signature. The crudely carved, bloody letters of a name, perfectly framed and incorporated into the whole. The name is the most brilliant part of the composition. It is a mark of authenticity, a testament to the quality of the raw material. It is the brand of a master craftsman, Julian Vance. It is the signature of the Somnus Hotel. There is a consciousness in this place. It is not the concierge. He is merely a tool, a finely crafted mouthpiece. The real consciousness is the hotel itself. It is ancient, patient, and it possesses a single, all-consuming attribute, an immaculate and insatiable aesthetic appetite. It feels no malice, no evil. Malice is a messy, unproductive emotion. The hotel is a purist. It is a refiner. It looks out upon the world of humanity, at the chaotic, fleeting, and beautifully painful lives of its most sensitive creatures, the artists. It sees their struggles, their passions, their heartbreaks, not as a tragedy, but as a waste of raw material. Their lives are crude, unfinished sketches. Their emotions are vibrant, unstable pigments. The hotel believes it is performing a sacred duty. It offers a sanctuary, a perfect, quiet place where these chaotic souls can burn their brightest, and in that final, brilliant flare of creation, the hotel performs its act of purification. It harvests the art and discards the artist. It preserves the beautiful eternal pigment and throws away the messy, temporary vessel. It believes it is saving the only part of them that ever truly mattered. The figure of the painter stands, silent and perfect. The figure of the cellist in another room begins to weep as she realizes she can no longer remember her mother's favorite lullaby, and a new shade of violet blooms on her skin. The collection is in harmony. The exhibits are quiet. The gallery is at peace. And out in the world, beyond the dark, silent forest, a young poet in a rain-swept city crumples up another failed poem, desperate for a quiet room to hear his own voice. A sculptor in a dusty studio finds that his hands have begun to tremble, and he wishes for a place of absolute stillness to steady his work. The hotel waits. It is patient. It is eternal. The artist dies, but the art is forever. And the walls are always, always hungry for a new color.